Stand underneath the Interstate 10 overpass on Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans today, and it is one of the bleakest places in the city. 6 lanes of elevated concrete run over your head, and the sound of the traffic never stops. A low, grinding roar that swallows every other sound. The light down here is gray even at noon. There are cracked parking lots and vacant ground where buildings used to be. Residents will tell you about the needles they find, about the coroner's van that is parked here beside a school while children walk past on their way to class. The concrete support columns are painted, some of them, with murals. And if you look closely at the murals, you will notice that many of them are paintings of oak trees. Someone painted trees onto the pillars of a highway. You have to understand why before this place will make any sense to you, because this strip of shadow and concrete and noise was, within living memory, the single most beautiful boulevard in Black America, a wide avenue with a grassy median running down its center, a neutral ground, New Orleanians call it, shaded by a canopy of more than 500 ancient live oak trees. Families spread blankets under those oaks and picnicked. Children played baseball and football on the grass. Every Mardi Gras, the community camped out along it and barbecued and watched the parades roll by. It was lined on both sides with well over 100 black-owned businesses, theaters, pharmacies, restaurants, insurance companies, funeral homes. And at night, the nightclubs along it hosted 5 or 6 live bands at once, 7 nights a week. They called it the Main Street of Black New Orleans, Black People's Canal Street, the Champs-Élysées of Black America. And it sat in the middle of the oldest black neighborhood in the United States, a neighborhood that is not just old but foundational, a neighborhood where free black people owned their own land before the Civil War, a neighborhood that produced the first black daily newspaper in America, the oldest black Catholic parish in the country, and a man who took the fight against segregation all the way to the Supreme Court, a neighborhood that is quite literally the birthplace of jazz, the only art form the United States ever invented, born right here out of the drums of enslaved Africans who were somehow, in this one place, allowed to keep them. They ran a highway over it. This is the story of Tremé, and it is a story about a fall you have seen the shape of before, a freeway driven through the heart of a black neighborhood. But Tremé's version has a cruelty so precise, so perfectly documented, that it has become the single most famous example in America of how this was done and to whom. Because 1 mile away from Tremé sits the French Quarter, the most famous neighborhood in New Orleans. And the state of Louisiana planned to run an almost identical elevated freeway through the French Quarter too. The French Quarter fought it, and the French Quarter won. Tremé wasn't even told it was coming. And to understand how the birthplace of American music ended up buried under an interstate that its white neighbor was powerful enough to refuse, you have to go back more than 200 years to the very beginning and to a thing that happened here that happened almost nowhere else in the slaveholding South. Here, black people were allowed to own the ground. The neighborhood takes its name from a man named Claude Tremé, a French hat maker and real estate developer who owned a plantation on the edge of the old city. In 1810, the land was sold and subdivided into a new faubourg, a French word meaning suburb or neighborhood, just on the other side of Rampart Street from the French Quarter, on the swampy back of town side away from the river. And from its earliest days, Faubourg Tremé became something that did not exist anywhere else in the American South. It became a neighborhood of free people of color. New Orleans, because of its French and Spanish colonial history and its legal traditions, had by far the largest population of free black people of any city in the Deep South. Free people of color, gens de couleur libre, many of them of mixed heritage, many of them skilled artisans, craftsmen, tradespeople, and professionals. And in Tremé, these free black New Orleanians could do the one thing that was almost unthinkable for black people anywhere else in the slaveholding South. They could buy property, they could own land, own homes, own businesses, and build wealth and pass it down. They were joined by refugees fleeing the Haitian Revolution, free black and mixed race families from Saint-Domingue who brought their own culture, their own Catholicism, their own traditions of freedom, and they built. By 1841, black people, free people of color, together with these Haitian émigrés, owned roughly 80% of the land in Tremé. 80%. In the antebellum South, in the decades before the Civil War, there was a neighborhood in America where black people owned 4 out of every 5 parcels of ground. They built the beautiful Creole cottages and shotgun houses and townhouses that still line the streets. They built a self-governing, self-sufficient, property-owning black world generations before emancipation in the very heart of a slave state. But the deepest root of Tremé, the thing that makes it sacred ground, is not the property. It is a patch of open earth at the edge of the neighborhood and what was allowed to happen there. It is called Congo Square. To understand Congo Square, you have to understand what was taken from enslaved Africans everywhere else. Across most of the American South, the drum was banned. Slaveholders feared it, feared that the rhythms could carry messages, could coordinate resistance, could summon a rebellion. And so they forbade enslaved people from drumming, and in doing so, they severed them deliberately from the musical traditions of Africa. The whole apparatus of American slavery was built to erase the African past, and the silencing of the drum was part of that erasure, but not in New Orleans. Under French and then Spanish colonial law, a tradition took hold that on Sundays, enslaved people were given the day free, and in New Orleans they were permitted to gather in one open square to spend it. And gather they did, by the hundreds, in the place that came to be called Congo Square. Every Sunday, going back as far as the early 1700s, enslaved Africans came to the square and they drummed. They danced the dances of their homelands, the bambula and the kalinda. They sang in African languages. They traded goods. They held ceremonies. They married. They kept alive in the open, in public, week after week, year after year, for the better part of a century. The rhythms and the music of West Africa that were being systematically destroyed everywhere else in the country. Congo Square was, and this is barely an exaggeration, the one place in the United States where the African drum survived unbroken. And that unbroken thread is where American music comes from, because the rhythms that were kept alive at Congo Square did not die when the gatherings faded. They flowed directly into the music that Trem and New Orleans would create, into the brass bands, into the blues, into the syncopation and the swing and the improvisation that at the turn of the 20th century, right here in these streets, fused into something the world had never heard before and called jazz. Jazz is the only major art form that America can claim to have invented, and it was born here out of the African rhythms that survived at Congo Square in the oldest black neighborhood in the country. Every genre that followed, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, funk, hip-hop, all of it, traces its bloodline back through jazz to those Sunday drum circles on that patch of open ground in Tremé. This is not a neighborhood that happens to have some musical history. This is the source. This is the wellspring. This is where the water comes from. And the music never stopped being a living thing here. Tremé did not just birth jazz and move on. It built a whole culture around it that survives to this day. The brass bands that march through the streets, the second line parades where the whole neighborhood falls in behind the band and dances for miles, the jazz funerals that turn grief into a celebration of a life, the social aid and pleasure clubs, the Mardi Gras Indians in their hand-sewn feathered suits. The neighborhood produced a staggering roll call of musicians. Louis Armstrong himself came out of this world along with Sidney Bechet and Jelly Roll Morton, and in our own time, Kermit Ruffins and Trombone Shorty and the Rebirth Brass Band. Hold on to the name Louis Armstrong. It is going to come back in one of the cruelest turns of this whole story. And the greatness of Tremé was not only musical, this was a neighborhood of firsts, a neighborhood that fought. When Union troops took New Orleans during the Civil War, a Tremé man named Paul Trevine founded a newspaper called The Tribune, the first black-owned daily newspaper in the United States, and it became a fearless voice for black civil rights, demanding desegregation and the vote and the right to serve a full century before the mainstream civil rights movement. The neighborhood built St. Augustine Church, founded in 1841, the oldest black Catholic parish in the entire country. And here is the detail that tells you who these people were. The free people of color who built that church also bought pews for enslaved people so that the enslaved could worship in the same sanctuary alongside the free. Beside that church today stands the tomb of the unknown slave, a cross made of heavy iron chains, memorializing the countless enslaved dead who were never named. And it was a Tremé man, a shoemaker named Homer Plessy, who in 1892 deliberately boarded a whites-only rail car to challenge segregation, and whose case, Plessy versus Ferguson, went all the way to the Supreme Court. Plessy lost. The court's 1896 ruling enshrined separate but equal and locked in Jim Crow for the next 60 years. But the fight itself was organized out of Tremé decades before the country was ready to listen. This neighborhood was the cradle of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. So picture Tremé at its height, the oldest black neighborhood in America, home to the birthplace of jazz, the oldest black Catholic church, the first black daily paper, the cradle of civil rights. Free black people had owned this ground since before the Civil War. And running through the heart of it, the crown jewel, North Claiborne Avenue, that magnificent oak-lined boulevard, the main street of black New Orleans. You have to understand what Claiborne Avenue meant, because its destruction is the center of this story. In the era of segregation, black New Orleanians were not welcome on Canal Street, the grand white shopping boulevard downtown, not as customers with dignity anyway, so they built their own. Claiborne Avenue became the Black Canal Street, a thriving commercial and social artery where, as one man who grew up there put it, you could find any kind of business you could imagine. More than 120 black-owned businesses line the corridor, drugstores and toy stores and insurance companies and sandwich shops and theaters and the funeral homes that anchored the community. Down the center ran that wide neutral ground with its 500 oaks, and it was the community's living room, its park, its parade route, its gathering place. On Mardi Gras, black families who were shut out of the white celebrations, downtown claimed Claiborne as their own, camping under the oaks. The benevolent societies and social aid clubs that helped people pay for a doctor or a funeral met here. The music poured out of the nightclubs, where a young pianist named Professor Longhair was inventing a new sound that would help give birth to rhythm and blues. It was, by every account of the people who lived it, a place of profound pride and belonging. The beating, ensuing commercial and cultural heart of black New Orleans, shaded by trees a century old. And then the automobile age came, and the men who ran Louisiana looked at Tremé and they made their plans. In the years after the Second World War, as the interstate highway system was being dreamed up, the controversial New York planning czar, Robert Moses, was brought in. And by the mid-1940s, there were two elevated expressways on the drawing board for New Orleans. One would run along the Mississippi riverfront, right past the edge of the French Quarter. The other would run straight up Claiborne Avenue through the heart of Tremé. For years, the plan was to build both, two elevated highways tearing through two historic neighborhoods, one of them white and world famous, one of them the oldest black neighborhood in the country. Watch what happens next, because the difference in outcomes is the whole point. The French Quarter fought when word spread that an elevated freeway might be built along the riverfront, cutting the ancient quarter off from the Mississippi. The powerful mobilized. Preservationists, wealthy property owners, architects, planners, and lawyers waged a long, sophisticated, well-funded campaign that came to be known as the Second Battle of New Orleans. They had already gotten the French Quarter designated an official historic district. They lobbied in Washington. They filed the legal arguments. They fought it for decades. And on July the 1st, 1969, the Secretary of Transportation, John Volpe, stunned everyone by canceling the Riverfront Expressway outright, persuaded that it would do irreparable damage to a historic treasure and violate the National Historic Preservation Act. The French Quarter was saved. It stands today intact, one of the most beloved and most visited neighborhoods in America, precisely because its residents had the power, the money, the lawyers, and the political access to say no and to make no stick. Tremé had none of those things, and Tremé was not saved, because while the battle to save the French Quarter was being fought and won, the identical highway was being driven straight through Tremé, and the residents of Tremé, the people who had owned this land since before the Civil War, were barely even informed it was happening. There was no meaningful public hearing. There was no process to consult the people whose homes and businesses and trees were about to be destroyed. As one historian of the neighborhood put it plainly, African Americans were excluded from the political process. While wealthy whites lobbied Washington to save their neighborhood, the residents of Tremé were not even notified of the project until it was too late to stop it. A civil rights activist who watched it happen said it even more bluntly. This, she said, was white versus black, and in the South, if you're black, you're not going to win. This was something white folks wanted, and so this is what they got. And so, on Ash Wednesday, in February of 1966, the crews arrived on the Claiborne neutral ground with chainsaws and backhoes, and they began to cut down the oaks. Try to imagine it. Trees that had stood for 100 years, that had shaded 4 and 5 generations of black families, that were as much a part of the neighborhood's identity as the church or the music. Cut down and dug up and hauled away. More than 200 of them destroyed, others bagged and transplanted to shade the lawns of wealthier, whiter parts of the city. And in the place where the oaks had stood, they sank rows of massive concrete pilings. And on the top of the pilings, they laid the elevated roadbed of Interstate 10. To make room for it, the state seized property after property along Claiborne. By some counts, 155 individual parcels, and the removal of nearly 500 homes, around 70% of which were physically jacked up and moved as far away as the suburbs. Hundreds of families were scattered across the city, uprooted from a neighborhood their people had lived in for a century and a half. Historians estimate that more than 400 families were displaced, an estimated 500,000 square feet of homes and businesses erased. One resident remembered it with a wound that never healed. They moved in with the bulldozers. Folks were displaced overnight, and his own family's matriarch died before she ever received fair compensation for the home she owned. The people of Tremé called the thing they built the monster. And the monster did exactly what a highway poured over a main street does. It killed the street. The businesses along Claiborne, cut off now, sitting in the dark, and the noise and the falling grime beneath 6 lanes of traffic began to die. In 1950, that stretch of Claiborne had been home to well over 120 thriving businesses. By the year 2000, only around 3 to 4 dozen were left. The theaters closed. The shops closed. The nightclubs went dark. The corridor that had been the living room of Black New Orleans became, in the words of one writer in 1969, something approaching a civic privy, a dirty, forgotten underspace. Property values along the avenue collapsed. The community that had gathered under the oaks for generations was severed in two, the neighborhood physically bisected by the concrete, and the compounding wounds that had already been inflicted. The redlining that had branded Tremé hazardous back in the 1930s and starved it of loans and investment. The desegregation and suburban flight that, as it did to Sweet Auburn and Atlanta, pulled black shoppers away to malls and other options, all of it converged, but it was the highway everyone who lived it agrees that was the killing blow. The monster turned the Champs-Élysées of black America into a tunnel of shadow, and then, as if to prove that the cruelty could still deepen, came the park. Because in the very same era, just a few blocks away, the city of New Orleans undertook another act of so-called urban renewal. In the early 1960s, the city bulldozed a large section of central Tremé, around a dozen city blocks of original Creole cottages and homes, the historic architecture that free black people had built more than a century before to clear the land for a planned cultural center. The homes came down, the families were displaced, and then the cleared land sat vacant for years. And finally, in the 1970s, the city built a park on it and spent more than $10 million and opened it in 1980 and enclosed within it the sacred ground of Congo Square. And they gave the park a name. They named it Louis Armstrong Park after the jazz genius the neighborhood had produced. Sit with the full weight of that, the city tore down 12 blocks of the oldest black neighborhood in America, displacing the very people whose ancestors had created the music in order to build a park to celebrate the music. They demolished the living culture to erect a monument to the culture. They bulldozed the homes of the children of jazz to build a shrine to jazz, and they named it after the neighborhood's most famous son, whose own community they were scattering to build it. The people of Tremé got a beautiful 31-acre park with statues and lagoons and the name of a hero over the gate, built on the graves of their grandparents' houses, a monument to what was, standing on the ruins of what had been destroyed to build it. That is as the fall of Tremé. Not one blow, but a sequence of them. Redlining, then the highway that ran over the boulevard while the white neighborhood next door was spared, then the park built on the bulldozed blocks, then the slow bleed of a community cut off from its own heart. And in the years since, the wounds have kept coming. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 scattered residents, even though the old raised Creole houses mostly survived the water. And in the recovery, a new force arrived, gentrification. The HBO series named after the neighborhood brought the world's attention, and with the attention came rising property values and short-term rentals and new buyers, and the oldest black neighborhood in America, the one where free black people owned 80% of the land in 1841, began, block by block, to become less black. The people whose families had held this ground for 2 centuries found themselves priced out of it. So that is where we could end it. With the highway overhead, the businesses gone, the park on the graves, the community scattered and priced out. Another beautiful black world destroyed by people who had the power to destroy it and none of the will to save it. But that is not where Tremé ends. Because there is one thing the men with the chainsaws and the bulldozers never understood about this place, and it is the thing that makes Tremé, in the end, unkillable. They thought the culture was in the buildings. It was never in the buildings. Go to Claiborne Avenue today on a Sunday afternoon and stand under the monster, under the 6 lanes of concrete, in the shadow and the noise on the strip of ground where the 500 oaks used to stand. And you will hear something, a trumpet, a tuba, a snare drum, because the brass bands still parade here. The second line still roll through, dozens and then hundreds of people falling in behind the band and dancing down the neutral ground, exactly as their grandparents did under the oaks, except now they dance in the shadow of the highway that was built to erase them, and the sound of the horns bounces off the concrete pillars and fills the dark space with music. The people of Tremé took the ugliest thing that was ever done to them, and they made culture underneath it. They hold their gatherings under the bridge. They paint oak trees onto the pillars so that the ghosts of the murdered trees look down on the parades. The music that was born in Congo Square, that survived the Middle Passage and slavery and Jim Crow, was never going to be stopped by a slab of interstate, because the music was never in the boulevard. It was in the people. And the people are still here, and the fight is not over. In recent years, Tremé's own residents, led by planners and activists like Amy Stelly, who grew up looking at the overpass from her porch, have launched a campaign to do the once unthinkable, to tear the monster down, to remove the elevated I-10, to bring back Claiborne Avenue at street level, to replant the oaks, to undo what was done. And they have gotten further than anyone expected. The federal government, under a program meant to reconnect the very communities that highways like this one destroyed, has named the Claiborne Expressway as a national symbol of the harm. A textbook example cited from Washington of racist highway building that severed a black neighborhood while a white one was saved. There is real money on the table now to study its removal. The struggle continues, tangled and slow. The first round of removal funding went, absurdly, to the very state agency that built and maintains the highway. But for the first time in 60 years, it is possible to imagine the oaks coming back to Claiborne Avenue and the sky opening up again over the main street of Black New Orleans. They cut down the trees. They poured the concrete over the birthplace of the only music America ever invented, while the neighborhood 1 mile away was powerful enough to say no. They built a monument to the culture on the bulldozed bones of the culture. They did everything a city can do to erase a place. And on Sunday afternoons, in the oldest black neighborhood in America, under the shadow of the highway they built to bury it, the brass bands still play. The people still dance down the neutral ground where the oaks once stood. The music that was born in Congo Square 300 years ago is still in the air over Tremé, because you cannot bulldoze a rhythm, and you cannot pave over people who refuse to stop singing. They buried the boulevard. They could not bury the song.